So my name is Shrybman, and I'm going to talk to you today about climate justice and how international trade rules and corporate globalization fundamentally undermine our prospects for dealing with this pressing ecological and social problem. And I'm going to illustrate the point in 2 or 3 different ways. The first is to try to unpack the ways in which the globalization paradigm that's embedded in international trade agreements fundamentally accelerates the development dynamic that's actually fueling greenhouse gas emissions and increasing global consumption of energy. And that's probably easiest to understand when you think about food systems. And by food systems, I mean not just the process of producing food on farmland, but everything that goes with producing that food, which includes the tractors and the petrochemicals that are increasingly used to produce food as we industrialize agricultural production, and all of the systems for processing that food and transporting it and packaging it and moving it to markets. We know that we are fundamentally on an unsustainable path when it comes to food production. We use, the rough rule of thumb is something in the order of 10 calories of energy to produce a calorie of food. Not just produce, but produce and distribute and package and move the food to market and consumer. About 60% of that energy, again using rough rules of thumb, are used to package, process, and distribute food. When you put that understanding alongside the free trade globalization paradigm, you realize the two are on a collision course, because the free trade model is one that posits that we will all be better off if we simply become specialized producers of whatever we do best and trade in the international marketplace for what we need. So when it comes to food, we'll no longer be producing food, and this has largely come to pass in most of the world. We're no longer producing food for local consumers or to feed people. We're actually producing commodities, not food, but commodities to trade on international markets. Well, that's a cruel paradigm when you think about the indigenous farmers or the poor farmers on an ejido in Mexico, for example, that used to be able to produce food in local systems because they were supported by various government programs and collective ownership and marketing regimes, and no longer because under free trade, those aren't permitted. And now those people are living on a barrio on the outskirts of Mexico City and can't feed themselves. But when you think about what that's done in terms of the energy consumption of that food system, you begin to understand how it's driving increased energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. And the same is true of the model that displaces low-tech, low-key, low-input agriculture production by those same farmers, in those same communities, in those local food systems, now with industrial systems of production, genetically modified organisms, high energy input crops, lots of petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides. So not only have you destroyed local systems of production and trade, but now you've industrialized production and increased energy consumption that way as well. If you look at global food systems, everything from making the tractor to extracting the oil resources to making the packaging, you realize that this is probably the world's biggest business. I think arguably it is. The world's largest user of energy and the world's largest consumer of fossil fuels. And we've embraced a trade paradigm that will dramatically increase the energy demands of this system. Without really much understanding or analysis or assessment. In fact, if you speak to climate change activists about food, they'll tell you that agriculture isn't that much of the problem because it's, other than the gases that cows emit, it's only 4% of our energy use. The information isn't disaggregated on a system-wide basis, and that's one of the problems. That's how free trade fundamentally undermines, at a very systemic way, our prospects of actually dealing with climate change in a constructive and effective way. That's one. 2 is by creating international legal regimes that can be invoked to challenge the things that we need governments to do in order to cut back on greenhouse gas emissions. And a great example of that, a great but unfortunate example, is the fact that Japan and I think the EU and the United States have both piled on this dispute that has been brought under the World Trade Organization rules, the WTO, to challenge the Green Energy Act in Ontario. Why would that be? Well, because under the Green Energy Act in Ontario, producers of green energy in Ontario get a preferential rate for that energy when they sell it into the grid. But as a quid pro quo of paying people a lot more for green energy, the province expects that some of the investment in creating that technology will take place in Ontario. So you can sell power generated with photovoltaic cells into the grid. But wouldn't it be nice if some of those photovoltaic cells were manufactured in Ontario, or at least in Canada? And it's tying those two things together, which global corporations who want to be free to do whatever they want to do, wherever they do it in the world, and find the cheapest labor and the cheapest resources, cry foul about, and have now invoked international trade rules to challenge what's happening in Ontario. Canada has done something similar by threatening California and by making veiled threats to Europe that it will invoke trade rules to challenge clean fuel initiatives. Should Europe go that way? I think California already has. It was a hollow threat. But you see the way in which trade rules are invoked to chill government and regulatory initiative by raising the prospect of very onerous, very scary international trade challenges if governments go down that path. Even a more pernicious example is the fact that under international investment treaties, and there are now 2,000 or 3,000 of these, and certainly the investment rules of NAFTA are a good example, and the ones that Canada is now promoting as being a feature of a free trade agreement with Europe, empower transnational corporations to actually invoke international agreements, trade agreements and investment agreements, to which they're not a party. They have no obligations under these agreements, but they can invoke them to challenge domestic initiatives that interfere with their investment rights. Well, what are investment rights in this context? They're the rights, for example, to take water to manufacture oil from the tar sands. We know that we use somewhere between 3.5, I think, and 5.5 barrels of water to manufacture a barrel of oil from the tar sands. We're using water in Alberta in an entirely unsustainable and in a rapacious way in order to produce is it probably 2 or 3 million barrels of oil that we produce each day from the tar sands, and that number is supposed to increase substantially. Any effort by the province of Ontario to curtail that water use will certainly be confronted by an investor straight challenge demanding compensation, and we'd be talking about compensation in the order of hundreds of millions of dollars should a future Alberta government have the temerity to go there. Why am I so confident that would happen? Because that's exactly what happened in Newfoundland. The production process wasn't oil and gas, the production process was pulp and paper. And when Abitibi-Bowater decided to close a pulp and paper plant in Newfoundland, the province said, well, you know what, we're taking back your water license that you used to generate power to fuel the pulp and paper mill, because as a condition of having that water license, you were supposed to employ people in Newfoundland. You're no longer doing that. So you simply can't sell that power or sell the water rights to a third party because they don't belong to you, they belong to the people of Newfoundland. Abitibi-Bowater invoked Chapter 11 of NAFTA, that's the investor state suit provisions of NAFTA, sued Newfoundland for taking back something that was never given to the company, that has always belonged to the people of Newfoundland and the people of Canada. And the federal government actually settled the claim for $130 million in damages. That's why I'm confident that if an Alberta government decided to do something, anything like that, to recover water use rights from oil and gas companies that are far in excess of what the ecosystem can now endure, that it would be confronted with a similar claim. And under NAFTA rules, once you treat a particular investor in a particular way, you're entitled to accord all other investors similar treatment. Last example, and there are many, of how free trade fundamentally undermines or is a real impediment to achieving ecological justice. And we will achieve ecological justice. I'm doing this presentation so that you can begin to understand the need to deal with this particular impediment. And of course, there are many others that we have to concern ourselves with. But the last example is simply in writing in trade agreements very precise, very robust, very enforceable international rules that perpetuate a model of deregulation and globalization, which I've described in some ways, but are in many others antithetical to the need to, and the processes and policies and development models that we will need to pursue and achieve if we're to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Those are hard, binding rules. Compare them with what doesn't exist in international agreements about ecological security. If there's a silver lining in all of this, it's to appreciate that when the world is serious, and the world in this case are transnational corporations, in the example of trade, we can write very hard, very clear, very enforceable international agreements to achieve global objectives. Unfortunately, the agreements that we have written serve the interests of the most powerful companies in the world in pursuit of unsustainable development models, but obviously can be used for a much more important purpose. Why are the intellectual property rights that are embedded in the World Trade Organization more important than ecological security for people on Earth? Of course they're not. And so we need to tear more than one page out of their book, because they don't need these tools and resources, and put them into ours so that we have binding and effective international agreements to deal with this pressing ecological problem. Thanks.